started. Thank you so much for being here. Our next presenter is Jason Lyons, who worked with Dr. Laura Martin on a project called Transitioning Back to Civilian Life. I'll turn things over to Jason, and the other presenters will have time afterwards for questions about the presentation. Thank you so much, Jason.
Thank you all for being here. Like Dr. Moore said, my name is Jason Lyons, and I chose to sort of dive into our government resources, specifically relating to veteran reintegration. So one, I want to sort of talk about why I chose this, right? I'm a neuroscience major, business minor, but I have sort of this unique experience, I would say. Back home in Albuquerque, I serve at a homeless shelter, and growing up throughout high school, I served there and just noticed a large portion of the homeless that we would serve were veterans, right? And having conversations with these homeless veterans about how they ended up in the situations they did, and just previous research has shown that the percentage of veterans that are homeless compared to the normal population is much higher, right? And I think it's also interesting just the varying attitudes that veterans have, one towards their military experience and their reintegration, but also we as a society have different attitudes towards, again, the military, towards veterans in general. So, getting into some terminology that I'm going to mention. So, for the case for my study, I define a veteran as someone who qualifies for Veterans Affairs benefits, right? A lot of people talk about what exactly defines a veteran. More like broadly, a veteran is a person who served in the active military who is discharged on conditions other than dishonorable, right? So basically, they didn't commit any crimes while they were serving, and that's what a veteran is described as. And in terms of reintegration, that's sort of another broad term, but I define that as someone who was, again, in active military and then coming back into civil society. Some of these veterans had part-time, they were doing part-time work with the military, but had other jobs, and so that's how I define reintegration. And then we get into sort of the departments. So a vet center is a specific department within the Department of Veterans Affairs. So these are sort of like, I call them like satellite campuses of Veterans Affairs, and their job is to just provide transitional services as well as counseling services, things like that to veterans. And then we have the Department of Veterans Affairs, often referred to as the VA, and that's the overarching government agency that veterans and their families can get benefits from. And lastly, I'm going to discuss an outreach specialist, and that is someone who, you can see here at the bottom picture, that would be someone employed by a vet center or VA office, and their job is to be in communities and like discussing with veterans exactly the resources that they have available to them. So regarding previous research on veteran reintegration, I sort of dove into attitudes as well as possible proposed improvements of veteran reintegration resources and programs. And first and foremost, it can't be understated that the role of veteran identity was very prevalent in this research. The idea of a shared experience, oftentimes overseas, that veterans get very ingrained, and oftentimes a lot of veterans really love their time of service and have great bonds that are formed. And so Gina Barecha, she's a local reporter in Hartford, Connecticut, she did sort of this overarching article in which she wanted to investigate why veterans are so close, why they seek out lifetime friendships with each other, and one veteran described it like a brother or sisterhood because the bonds are formed through hardship, physical pain, fears, and accomplishments. And further, we talk about, again, how the time of service, the time of military service is very team-oriented. You have a lot of team-oriented tasks. You think of like a common goal versus these veterans coming back into society that's very individualistic, very money-driven, things like that. Furthermore, I looked into specific government assistance programs for veterans transitioning. I looked into the Transition Assistance Program and then the Homeless Veterans Reintegration Program. And in terms of the critiques of those, we have a study done at Perkins et al. In 2020 found that the Homeless Veterans Reintegration Program actually largely targeted veterans who were almost 5 years removed of their time of service, which by the name may make sense, right? Normally you don't come back and are immediately homeless, but actually there's a lot of resources within this program that are in charge of employment, housing, things like that. So there was an issue with that, and then also with the Transition Assistance Program, according according to Woodward et al. In a study done in 2020, the transition assistance program lacked an individualized approach to each veteran. So really, the transition assistance program really was just encouraging veterans to use their GI Bill, which is funding for education post-high school, as well as some job opportunities, but very little. And importantly, research revealed that we need to recognize the chronological aspects of reintegration, right? That there's stages to the reintegration. So because of that, I sort of wanted to investigate from two sides. One, I wanted to see what veterans' views of these reintegration programs are, but also those who work with veterans and working professionals who work with veterans. I wanted to see if they had any input on proposed improvements and how their veterans see the assistance they're getting. So qualitatively, I did a one-on-one interview with a vet center trauma counselor at the Austin Vet Center over here on I-35 in Riverside, in which we sort of just had a longer discussion about what he does day to day. He's a veteran himself, so we talked about his own Vietnam veteran reintegration, as well as what services are offered at vet centers that veterans have access to. And then on the other side, I did a quantitative survey. Here you can see the recruitment poster for that. And I had an Austin Vet Center sample, so I put this up in the local Austin Vet Center as well. And then I had a snowballing sample of personal contacts that I had, friends and family who are veterans, and they were able to pass that on to other people who know their veterans. And once all data collection was stopped with that, I did an analysis, synthesizing and comparing the themes from the interview and surveys, again looking for the attitudes towards the reintegration programs as well as proposed improvements. So in terms of the interview, I found some interesting things. One, when I talked about the outreach specialist, this trauma counselor was very adamant on the fact that this connection between the actual services that are offered by the government and the veterans, we need to bridge that gap, right? And so he talked a lot about the importance of the outreach specialists being in local communities and making veterans aware of what resources they have access to. Again, similarly, he talked about just how important and how many services really there are at the VA and vet centers. There's individual counseling, group counseling, employment, even the vet center he works at has family therapy, so lots of different, in his opinion, there's lots of different resources available. And then we talked about relating to his own reintegration, about how just the attitudes towards veterans, attitudes toward the military in general have increased in certain ways, but then there's also still great room for improvements. Obviously, you still have a great homeless veteran population. And then he just mentioned how a lot of people who work in these places need to have a sense of responsibility to create a space for veterans to be able to come and reveal their trauma, but also know that that's a safe space to share everything they've experienced. Now, in terms of my survey, I had 6 total participants that completed it. And in terms of the important themes, so those who actually did use government services during their integration, they found some benefit, but really the only benefit they found was that it provided connections with other veterans to share their experience. They didn't really see much improvement in terms of being offered counseling, things like that. And then a really important finding, in my opinion, was employment. So those that had jobs set up prior to the time that they were going to come back and knew exactly what they were going to do during their reintegration, what jobs they were going to have coming back to civilian life, they reported their reintegration experience as much more seamless than those who didn't have a job. And so getting into my third one is those who were sort of uninformed about any services available to them felt very much lonely, often describing themselves as lonely. And then a theme that came out of my previous research, which also was shown here, is that a lot of these veterans talked about how individualistic society was, and how even in the jobs that they were working, that it didn't seem as team-oriented, and just sort of a lack of community. And then in terms of improvements, obviously still employment opportunities were at the forefront, but then a more holistic approach. So multiple veterans talked about how they would have preferred to be enrolled in a program that encapsulated their psychological, spiritual, and physical well-being. So where's the gap here? What are our implications? I think personally that the gap here was sort of between the quantitative and qualitative data, right? The interview showed that this vet center had the available resources according to the trauma counselor, right? And he talked all about how great these resources were. But then in my quantitative data, in the surveys, we hear a lot of veterans being frustrated with, one, not even knowing that these services are available, but two, when they use the services, that they're not very impressed and don't find the usefulness of them. And so I think, again, getting back to this importance of outreach specialists is how do we bridge that gap? How can we get into more communities? And then maybe the issue is actually that veterans don't want to use the programs, but we need to know that first. We need to get outreach specialists to actually encourage veterans to use their services. And again, the employment's role in the integration needs to be heavily considered. I think that it speaks to a lack of purpose when you're coming back and you don't have a career. A lot of people find purpose in their careers, right? And so when you get into that and you come back and have no career, it can be quite debilitating. In terms of the limitations of my study, obviously I just focused on government-funded reintegration programs. I didn't look at any nonprofit organizations. Some nonprofits do great work. The number of participants were pretty low, particularly regarding the one-on-one interviews. I would have loved to have more one-on-one interviews. And then just had a small data collection window of only about a month and a half for my surveys. So moving forward, I want to get into some measurable actions that can be taken. I think it's important that we target research towards the outreach of these services to veterans, again, and get in front of local vet communities and encourage them to use the resources. And then, obviously, there was claims made by the vet center counselor that they have lots of room, lots of availability for veterans. And that could just be a concentrated thing within Austin, and we don't know as a broader sort of like VA as a whole. We need to see what capacity the vet centers and Veterans Affairs offices actually are at, and then we can move forward. If there is a ton of availability, then we can move forward with that. And lastly, specific investigations into programs that are most used by veterans. I think a lot of veterans sort of push off to the side the idea of the government helping them and more look towards nonprofit organizations, and that's an interesting finding in itself. But if we could look at more nonprofit organizations as well as the sort of popular government assistance programs and take from that to just better increase the treatment of veterans. But I think moreover is just having conversations around veteran treatment as a whole, I think is really important. So thank you all, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Jason. Are there questions?
Yeah.
You mentioned that there were a few limitations and you didn't get to look at nonprofits in this survey.
Right.
How would you like to expand your research if you continue to do it, and would you look at specific organizations or just general availability?
Yeah, I think I would look at specific organizations. I've heard very good things about the One Border Project as well as Team Red, White, and Blue. Specifically, I would want to look at how they do their outreach, right? Is this, a lot of these nonprofits have the majority of their employees are veterans, and so that's something that's very encouraging to veterans to go to somewhere where they feel understood. So I think research regarding the outreach that nonprofits do is really interesting and a good next step.
I was curious about the funding within, you said it was focused on government funding. How is that distributed between the different organizations, or does it differ across states, or how, if you know about how that's distributed?
Yeah, so it's mainly national funding. And the big two that I focused on were the Transition Assistance Program, and that targets veterans about a year prior to them getting out of the military. And then the Homeless Veterans Reintegration Program, like I said with the name, in the 1980s it was sort of revamped, but they didn't change the name. So the Homeless Veterans Reintegration Program offers help for employment, housing, as well as homelessness. So those are the two major like government funded ones, and then you obviously have the VA, which is tons of government funding flows into that, and then that's where you get the event centers, which are sort of these satellite campuses around the whole U.S.
So you have this really interesting finding that people who were coming back straight into the job seem to report better experiences. Well, what do you think maybe the government or other organizations should do with that finding, if that's something that we can extrapolate to other?
Yeah, I think the idea behind the transition assistance program and targeting veterans a year before they actually get out is it's a really great idea. But I also know that the transition assistance program often is just sort of mentioned with veterans, and it's sort of on them to take advantage of the program themselves. And it's not, I guess you could say it's just very limited in scope in terms of actually recruiting veterans. So I think the finding that can be taken there is almost like a required enrollment in the transition assistance program versus just saying that these resources are available to you.
In your one-on-one interviews, did you notice anything about the holistic approach? Did they mention anything about a holistic approach, and specifically with the spiritual development and the psychological development, what helped the process of reintegration?
Yeah, so in the one-on-one interview, he talks a lot about the trauma counseling he does. He really focused mainly on psychological things. He also mentioned the importance of the family and friends. I guess that could be towards more of spiritual, but it was mainly focused on psychological. So I think that would be really important, of like looking at this holistic approach to reintegration, and that wasn't mentioned at the time of the event center. So yeah.
Can I invite your advisor to come up? Mr. Martin, thank you so much. Dr. Martin will have a chance to say a few things about working with Jason, and also to give him Stoll and Cord aware at graduation and recognition. Thank you for your hard work and honors.
Well, I am so excited to present you this for all of your hard work. And this was the first time this semester that I actually met Jason, and I cannot stress how much his perseverance, his passion for this project, which was just inspired me. I've learned so much from it. And, when he mentions the fact that, the limitations, I think one of the things to consider is that, the VA is an internal organization, and all of these kind of government silos are really difficult to navigate and to get in, but he was able to do that with his perseverance. And the other aspect is, I think, the daunting qualitative and quantitative process, and first time for qualitative and doing all this stuff. So I'm very, very grateful. And just have much continued success.
Join me in congratulating Jason.